He built furniture with his hands and raised a daughter alone. She built a $1 billion empire before 30 and thought that was enough. One rainy night in a small town, their worlds collided, and nothing would ever be the same. This is the story of a woman who had everything the world could see, and a man who gave her everything it couldn't. If this story finds you tonight, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, follow along, and don't go anywhere, because what happens between Logan Reed and Victoria Hale will remind you why real love always shows up when you've stopped looking for it. The rain had been falling for 3 hours by the time Logan Reed finally shut off the lights in his workshop. He didn't rush. He never rushed anymore. Rushing was something he'd stopped doing around the time he realized that moving fast through life meant missing the parts that mattered. So he took his time wiping down the workbench, hanging his chisels in their proper slots on the pegboard, running a dry cloth over the half-finished cabinet that had been sitting in the corner for 2 weeks because Mrs. Adler kept changing her mind about the drawer pulls. Maple or walnut, Logan? She'd called him 4 times this week alone. He didn't mind. Mrs. Adler was 81, and her late husband had commissioned that cabinet 30 years ago before he died, and she wanted it right. Logan understood that kind of wanting things right. He turned off the workshop light and stepped into the connecting hallway that led to the main house, toeing off his sawdust-caked boots at the door the way he'd been doing every night for 6 years. The house was quiet in the particular way houses get quiet when a child is asleep. Not silence exactly, more like a held breath. He padded up the stairs in his socks and pushed open the door to Marigold's room just far enough to see her. She was 8 years old and she slept the way she did everything else, completely. Arms thrown wide, one foot hanging off the mattress, hair going in 4 different directions. A stuffed rabbit named Sergeant Bun was clutched against her chest. Logan stood in the doorway for a moment just watching her breathe, the way he'd been doing since she was 3 days old and he'd been terrified to look away. He pulled her door mostly shut and went back downstairs. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a long moment, seeing nothing useful. He'd meant to go to the grocery store Tuesday. It was now Thursday. He settled for the last of the leftover pasta from 2 nights ago, ate it cold over the sink because the thought of dirtying a pot at 10:30 at night felt genuinely insurmountable. And then he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the rain coming down in the backyard. This was his life. He knew it. And most nights, standing in his quiet kitchen in his socked feet, eating cold pasta, he felt something close to peace about that. Most nights. He'd grown up in Mill Haven, which was the kind of town that people from bigger places always described as charming when they meant small. It sat about 40 minutes from the nearest city, the kind of distance that sounds like nothing until you're doing it twice a day. There was a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a barber shop, 2 competing pizza places, and a flower shop that had been run by the same family for 3 generations. There was a park at the center of town that nobody called by its official name. Everyone just called it the park, and a creek that flooded every April without fail. Logan had left once. Right after high school, he'd gone to the city with the vague ambition that a lot of 18-year-olds carry, the idea that something important was waiting for him somewhere that wasn't here. He'd spent 4 years studying furniture design and woodworking at a technical college, which his mother called a waste of a good mind, and his father called at least it's honest work, which was the closest his father ever came to approval. He'd gotten an apartment with a guy named Desmond who played guitar badly and owed him $40 for 7 months. He'd dated a woman named Claire for almost 2 years. He'd worked nights at a restaurant bussing tables and days at a furniture restoration shop learning things that his formal classes hadn't taught him. And then Claire had gotten pregnant. And then Claire had decided she didn't want to be pregnant. Or more accurately, she'd decided she didn't want to be a mother, which she'd explained to him in a careful, rehearsed-sounding way that he'd understood was the result of a lot of private deliberation. He'd sat across from her at the kitchen table of their apartment. Desmond had finally moved out by then. And he'd listened to her, and he'd understood what she was saying, and he'd felt the floor drop out from under him. Not because of Claire. He'd known, somewhere in the honest part of himself, that he and Claire had been running out of road for a while, but because of the fact that there was going to be a person, and he hadn't been able to make himself think of it any other way. Claire had been gracious about it. She'd signed everything willingly, no lawyers needed, just a conversation, and then paperwork, and then a goodbye that had been sad. in the way that real endings are sad. Not dramatic, but just real and a little terrible. She'd moved to Portland, he'd heard later. She was a graphic designer now. He hoped she was happy. He'd brought Marigold home to Millhaven when she was 11 days old. He'd been 24. He'd known almost nothing. His mother had shown up the first morning with a diaper bag, a casserole, and an expression on her face that he would only later recognize as barely contained terror on his behalf. His father had come the following week, held Marigold for approximately 90 seconds with the careful discomfort of a man who'd forgotten how to hold something that small, and said, "She's got good lungs," which was the closest his father ever came to saying, "She's beautiful, and I'm scared for you, son." 8 years later, Logan ran his workshop out of the converted garage attached to the house his parents had helped him buy, built custom furniture on commission, and sold smaller pieces online, coached Marigold's soccer team on Saturday mornings despite having played zero soccer in his life, and drove her to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and made most of her lunches and helped with most of her homework. His parents were 20 minutes away. His best friend Danny was around the corner. He had a small life, and it fit him the way a well-made thing fits, everything in its place. He was not unhappy. He just sometimes, on rainy Thursday nights, ate cold pasta over the sink and wondered what he'd forgotten to want. The Friday morning when Marigold first spotted the woman at the park started like every other Friday morning in September. Logan had made her scrambled eggs, and she'd declared them kind of watery while eating all of them. He'd packed her backpack, found her missing left shoe behind the couch, reminded her twice about her library book, and gotten her to school with 4 minutes to spare, which he counted as a significant personal victory. He'd spent the morning in the workshop finishing the Adler cabinet. Mrs. Adler had finally settled on walnut pulls. He'd gotten the call Wednesday. And in the afternoon, he'd picked Marigold up, and they'd gone to the park because she had approximately the energy level of a golden retriever, and their backyard wasn't big enough for what she needed. The park was half empty on a Friday afternoon. A couple of older guys on the chess tables. A woman with a stroller on the path. Marigold went immediately for the climbing structure, and Logan settled onto a bench with his coffee and the notebook he carried everywhere, where he sketched furniture designs when he had a few minutes. He'd been working on an idea for a freestanding bookcase with a built-in window seat for months. It kept not being right. He was staring at a sketch that still wasn't right when Marigold landed beside him on the bench like a bird suddenly changing direction. "Dad." "Yeah." "That lady over there has been sitting on the same bench for a really long time." He looked up. About 30 yards away on one of the park benches that faced the creek, a woman was sitting completely still. She had her elbows on her knees and she was looking at the water. She was wearing what Logan recognized from years of observing the way people from the city dressed when they came to Millhaven thinking no one would notice them, as expensive clothes in muted colors, dark coat, simple. Her hair was pulled back. From this distance, he couldn't see her face. "People are allowed to sit on benches, Mari." "I know, but she's been there since before I started climbing, and that was a really long time." "Go climb more." "I already climbed everything." "Twice?" She considered. "Mostly twice." "Go climb everything twice." She gave him the look to Musta, the one that was, according to his mother, disturbingly similar to a look he himself made. And then she went back to the climbing structure. Logan went back to his sketch. 5 minutes later, he heard a small voice that wasn't Marigold's. He looked up. Marigold was standing in front of the woman on the bench, approximately 0 feet of social distance, talking. The woman had looked up. Even from here, Logan could see something in the woman's posture. The particular stiffness of someone who hasn't interacted with another person in a while and is slightly startled to find themselves doing it. He got up and walked over. "Because my dad says that if you're sad, sometimes being around the creek helps," Marigold was saying. "He says moving water has something. I don't know what." "Marigold." Logan arrived at his daughter's side, hand on her shoulder. "Hey, sorry. She has no internal filter. It's something we're working on." He looked at the woman and stopped. She was around his age, 30, maybe. Her face was composed in the way of someone who'd been composing their face for a long time. The effort was nearly invisible, but it was there. Dark circles under eyes that were a clear, striking gray. She was pretty in a way that registered before he could think about registering it, but it wasn't the main thing about her face. The main thing was a quality of exhaustion so deep it had started to look like something else. Not sadness exactly. More like the kind of tired you get when you've been holding something up for so long your arms don't shake anymore because they've just gone numb. "It's fine," the woman said. Her voice was measured, controlled. "She's not bothering me." "She's right, though," Marigold said, seemingly encouraged by this. "About the creek. Dad figured it out when Sergeant Bunn went through the washing machine and I thought he was broken." "Sergeant Bunn is her rabbit," Logan said, because the woman looked like she might need that information. Something moved across the woman's face. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, the place where a smile lives. "Is the rabbit okay?" "He's fine," Marigold said. "He smells better now. Dad said sometimes things come out of hard things and they're actually better, even if they look kind of different." Logan looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old and sometimes she did this. Said something that landed with a precision he couldn't account for, that she wasn't even aware of landing. He never knew where it came from. The woman looked at Marigold for a long moment. When she looked up at Logan, something in her expression had shifted. Not open exactly, but less closed. "I'm Victoria," she said. "Logan, and the philosopher is Marigold." "I like your name," Marigold told her. "It sounds important." "Marigold," Logan said. "It does, though." Victoria looked at Marigold for another moment and then she laughed. Just once, just short, but it was real. Logan could hear the realness of it, the way it surprised her. He didn't know, standing there in the afternoon light with his notebook under his arm and his coffee going cold in his hand, who Victoria Hale was. The name meant nothing to him. He hadn't seen a business magazine in 2 years and didn't follow financial news and had never in his life read an article about a 30-year-old CEO. He would learn all of that later. What he knew in that moment was that she laughed like she'd forgotten she was allowed to, and that his daughter had made her laugh, and that she'd said her name to him like she was testing whether it still fit. "The creek really does help," he said. "My daughter is annoyingly right about most things." Victoria looked at the water. "I've been trying to figure that out," she said. "What helps?" "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" Logan said. He didn't ask what she needed help with. She didn't offer it. They stood there for a moment. Him, her, Marigold already drifting back toward the climbing structure, with the creek moving past them, and it was not awkward. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need anything added to it. "Nice to meet you, Victoria," Logan said. "You too," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. He found out who she was the next morning, and it was Marigold who told him. She'd been showing him something on his old laptop, a video about a salamander she'd seen by the creek, and she'd gotten distracted and started asking questions, and somehow that had led to Logan typing, "What's the most powerful person under 30?" into a search engine just to demonstrate something about the way searches work, and the third result had a photo. "That's her," Marigold said. "That's Victoria from the park." Logan looked at the photo. "Victoria Hale," the caption read. CEO, Hale Industries. And then below it, the headline, Hale Industries CEO, absent from Q3 earnings call. Board sources express concern. He sat with that for a moment. "Small world," he said finally. "Do you think she'll be at the park again?" Marigold asked. "I don't know, bud. I hope she comes back. She seemed really sad, but like the kind of sad that doesn't want you to know." Logan looked at his daughter. "When did you get so perceptive?" She thought about it seriously. "3rd grade," she said. "Miss Fortini said I have a lot of emotional intelligence. I looked it up. It basically means I notice stuff." "That's pretty much what it means. I think Victoria needs someone to notice." Logan closed the laptop. "Go eat your breakfast." She went. He sat there another moment, looking at the closed laptop, thinking about a woman in an expensive coat sitting alone on a park bench with that kind of exhaustion in her face, and about his daughter who noticed things. He wasn't looking for anything. He needed to be clear about that, even if only to himself. He had a life that was already full and sometimes overwhelming, and his bandwidth for complications was genuinely limited. He was a 32-year-old single father with sawdust in his hair and a half-finished bookcase in his garage, and a daughter who asked questions he didn't always have answers to. He was not looking for anything. Victoria Hale had come back to Millhaven. She'd been born here. That was the part that surprised people when they learned it, that someone who'd built Hale Industries into what it was had grown up in a town this size. But Millhaven was where her grandmother had lived, and for 3 summers in a row, when she was between 7 and 9, she'd spent weeks at a time in her grandmother's house on Birch Street, and that house was the place in her memory where safety lived. Her grandmother was gone now. The house had been sold years ago, but she'd come back anyway because she didn't know where else to go, and she'd rented a small furnished place on the edge of town without telling anyone, and she'd been there for 11 days when she met Marigold Reed in the park. The surgery had been in July, a procedure she'd been putting off for 2 years because she couldn't find a window in her schedule wide enough for the recovery, which her doctor had been increasingly direct about calling a dangerous choice. She'd finally done it in July and it had gone well. Technically, the surgeon's word technically, used in a way that meant the outcome was successful, but the patient was not supposed to hear the qualifier and ask follow-up questions. She'd asked follow-up questions. The answers had been thorough and had left her more frightened, not less, in the way that thorough answers sometimes do. She'd spent 6 weeks recovering in her apartment in the city, during which time her assistant came by daily and her board sent flowers, and her fiancé, Elliot, visited 5 times in 6 weeks, which she had not acknowledged at the time as the number it was. Elliot Chen had been in her life for 4 years. They'd met at a conference, they'd become something slowly, and then all at once, the way these things sometimes happen, they'd gotten engaged 14 months ago in a restaurant that had taken her assistant 3 weeks to book. He was successful in his own right, a corporate attorney who knew how to be the right kind of partner for someone in her position, which meant he understood the demands of her schedule and didn't take it personally when she canceled plans and could accompany her to events and knew what to say and what not to say in any room she needed him in. She had loved him. She believed she had genuinely loved him, though standing in Millhaven now, she found herself uncertain about what she'd been measuring when she felt that. He'd come to see her 3 weeks after the surgery on a Tuesday evening, and he'd sat across from her in her apartment living room, and he'd told her in a careful, thorough way. She recognized careful thoroughness now as the way people delivered things they'd been rehearsing, that he wasn't sure they wanted the same things anymore. He'd talked about timing and about what he wanted his future to look like, and at some point he'd said something about her being different now in a way that she'd asked him to clarify, and he hadn't quite been able to, which had told her everything. The clarity of his words hadn't. She'd asked him to leave. She'd sat in her apartment alone for 2 days, and then she'd called her assistant and told her she was taking a month for health reasons, which was not untrue. And she'd driven to Millhaven with a suitcase and a laptop, and the quiet, grinding knowledge that her absence from the city was being watched and analyzed by people who were waiting for it to mean something they could use. She wasn't wrong about that. She saw Logan again the following Wednesday. Not at the park. She'd gone into town to find a hardware store because the radiator in her rented house made a sound at night that she was fairly sure meant something was loose, and she didn't want to call the landlord because calling the landlord meant another person knowing she was here and asking questions, and she found herself standing in Millhaven Hardware with a radiator valve in her hand that she wasn't sure was the right size. That's the wrong size. She turned around. Logan Reed was standing behind her with a basket containing wood stain, sandpaper, and what looked like about 6 different sizes of wood screws. He was wearing a canvas work jacket with the sleeves pushed up, and there was a dark smudge of something, stain, probably, on his left forearm. He looked at the valve in her hand with the comfortable authority of someone who knew his way around a hardware store. "The one you want is 2 down," he said. She found the right valve. "Thank you." "Radiator problem?" "Something loose. It sounds like it's having an argument with itself every night around 2 in the morning." "Old building?" "Probably 1940s, he nodded. "Those old radiator systems, the steam traps go. It's usually not that complicated to fix if you know which part." He paused. "Do you want to know which part?" Victoria looked at him. He was asking in the same simple way he'd talked to her in the park. No performance of helpfulness, no waiting for her to be impressed. Just a straightforward question. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." He spent about 7 minutes walking her through it, which involved a brief detour to a different aisle, and a conversation about whether her radiator was a one-pipe or two-pipe system that she followed more easily than she expected, because he explained things in a way that assumed she could understand them rather than hoping she wouldn't need to. She paid attention. She'd always been good at paying attention to things that mattered. "Is Marigold with you?" she asked when they were walking toward the register. "School." He glanced sideways. "She asked about you, actually." Victoria hadn't expected that. "She did?" "She wants to know if you're still sad or if the creek helped." He said it with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone reporting accurate information. "She's 8. She doesn't have much of a filter between what she thinks and what she says." "I noticed." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Tell her the creek helped." "Did it?" She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, not at her, loading his items onto the counter. He'd asked the question like he was actually curious about the answer, not performing curiosity. "A little," she said. He nodded, like that was enough. Like a little was a real thing worth having. Outside the hardware store, on the sidewalk in the gray September morning, they stood for a moment in the particular pause that happens when a conversation could go either way. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," Logan said. "The coffee is actually good, which is unusual for the size of this town, if you have time." It was not a complicated offer. It wasn't anything other than what it sounded like. "I have time," Victoria said. But the diner was called Patty's, and it had clearly been called Patty's for about 40 years, judging by the sign, the booths, and the woman behind the counter who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been refilling coffee cups in the same space long enough that the geography of it had become part of her body. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, and they did a thing that Victoria, over the following weeks, would come to recognize as the particular thing Logan Reed was good at, which was have a conversation without an agenda. Most conversations in her life had agendas. Not hidden ones, necessarily. People weren't always being deceptive. But there was always a direction, a thing someone wanted from the conversation, a place it was heading. With Logan, she noticed that it went where it went. She found out that he made custom furniture and had been doing it out of his home workshop for 6 years. She found out that Marigold played soccer with a ferocity that surprised her opponents, and that she was currently very interested in salamanders specifically and amphibians generally, which had led to some difficult conversations about appropriate pets. She found out that his best friend Danny had recently started dating someone new and was handling it with all the self-possession of a teenager, which Logan described with the kind of fondness that's only available to people who like someone enough to also find them ridiculous. She didn't tell him much. She told him she was originally from here, loosely. Her grandmother had lived here. She'd spent time in Mill Haven as a kid. She told him she'd recently had surgery and was resting. She said she ran a company, and she kept her voice level when she said it, and he nodded and didn't ask anything follow-up, just said, "What kind?" And she said, "Technology infrastructure," and he said, "That sounds like something that creates a lot of problems for other people to solve." And it was so accurate and so undramatic that she laughed again, the same surprised way she'd laughed in the park. "Sorry," he said. "No, you're right. That's basically exactly what it does." She looked at her coffee. "I haven't thought about it like that." "I build things people can touch," Logan said. "I'm probably not the most objective person to ask about intangible industries." "Do you prefer that? Things you can touch?" He thought about it seriously. The way she was starting to understand he thought about most things. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do. There's something about being able to see when something's done. When the seam is right or the finish is even. You know when it's finished." Victoria thought about the last time she'd known when something was finished. She couldn't locate the memory. "I envy that a little," she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. He looked at her, not long. "I think things that are harder to measure are probably harder in ways I don't understand," he said. "I'm not trying to minimize it." "I didn't think you were." A pause. "How's the radiator holding up so far?" he asked. And just like that, they were somewhere else, and she found she was grateful for the ease of it. She fixed the radiator herself, following the steps he'd written down on the back of his hardware receipt. It took 45 minutes and one false start, and the use of language she wouldn't have used with company present. But she fixed it. And when she turned it on that night, and the apartment was quiet, She lay in bed listening to the silence where the knocking had been, and she felt something small and specific. Not happiness, not relief exactly, but the satisfaction of a problem solved by her own hands. She was alone in a rented apartment in a small town, and nobody knew exactly where she was, and her company was very probably in serious trouble. And the man she'd planned to marry had looked at her after her surgery and seen someone he didn't want to bet on. And she'd fixed her radiator. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. She didn't know what she was doing. She'd never in her life not known what she was doing. She was discovering a stranger feeling than she'd expected. Not free exactly, but unmoored. The way you feel when you've been running in one direction for so long that stopping is physically disorienting. Your body's still convinced it's moving even when it's still. Her phone was charging on the nightstand. She could see the screen light up intermittently with notifications she'd been managing carefully, selectively. She had people handling the day-to-day. She wasn't absent exactly. She was managing at a distance. But she knew, in the way she always knew things that she was allowing herself not to know yet, that the distance was not sustainable. The board was watching. Several of them had been watching for a while, in the particular way of people who've identified an opportunity and are waiting for the conditions to ripen. She knew the names. She knew the pattern. She'd been watching it herself. What she didn't know yet was how much Elliot had already told them. She saw Logan on Saturday at the park again, which was not planned by either of them. She'd been walking. She'd taken to walking in the mornings because it was something to do, because the apartment was small and quiet and the walls had started to feel like they had opinions. And she came into the park from the north entrance and nearly ran into Marigold, who was in the middle of sprinting somewhere important and who stopped dead when she saw Victoria. "You came back," Marigold said. "I was just walking." That's what all the people say when they come back. She appeared to take this as straightforwardly good news. "Dad's over there. He's drawing furniture again. He's been doing that for like an hour." Logan was on the same bench where Victoria had first sat. He had his notebook open and a pencil in his hand, and he had the slightly distracted look of someone whose brain was somewhere other than their body. "Hey," he said, looking up. "I told her not to ambush you." "She didn't ambush me. She was running." "I was running toward you," Marigold clarified. "That's kind of the same as ambush." "It's really not," Logan said. Victoria sat on the bench next to him, not because she'd planned to, but because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and they were quiet for a moment while Marigold went back to doing whatever she'd been doing before sprinting. "Can I see?" Victoria asked, nodding at the notebook. He handed it to her without hesitation. She looked at the sketch, a bookcase, freestanding, with a window seat built into the base. It was detailed and carefully drawn, the proportions thoughtful. "This is beautiful," she said. "It's not quite right yet." He reached over and tapped the lower section. "The seat depth isn't working for how it connects to the shelf structure. I keep solving it in a way that makes one thing work and the other thing worse." "So you're optimizing for the wrong variable?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what it is. What's the constraint you're not willing to give up? The seat has to be functional, deep enough to actually sit in. If it's decorative, I don't want to build it." She looked at the sketch. "Then the shelves need to step back here," she said, tracing her finger along the paper. "You're treating the shelf footprint as fixed, but if you cantilever this section slightly, this overhang here, you get your seat depth without compromising the vertical structure." He was quiet for a moment. He took the notebook back and looked at it. "Huh," he said. "Sorry, no." He was already sketching, modifying the lines. "You're right. That's actually right." He stopped and looked at her sideways. "You design things too?" "I design systems," she said. "It's not that different, structurally. You're always trying to figure out what the real constraint is and what's a habit of thinking." He nodded slowly, looking at the modified sketch. "I've been looking at that wrong for 3 months. Sometimes it helps to have eyes that aren't tired of it." A pause. Marigold was at the creek now, crouched down, looking at something in the water. The morning light was doing something good to the leaves, the first edges of them going gold, and the park had the quality it got on weekend mornings of being the kind of place people came to without urgency. "The surgery you mentioned," Logan said. He was looking at his sketch, not at her. "Is it Are you okay? You don't have to answer that. She was quiet for a moment. The question was so direct and so unglamorized that it sat in the air simply. They think so, she said. I think so. I'm still... She stopped. I'm still figuring out what okay means in this context. Fair enough. The hardest part isn't the physical thing, she said, and she was surprised to hear herself say it. She hadn't said this to anyone. The hardest part is that it changed how I was looking at things. Like, I'd been running at one speed for a long time, and then there was this stop. And in the stop, you see things you don't see when you're moving. What do you see? I see that I made a lot of choices out of momentum, she said, not out of actually wanting something, just because I was already going in that direction. Logan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful with it, careful in the good way, the way of someone who doesn't want to wreck something that's just been put on the table. I think that's one of the harder things to figure out, he said, whether you want something or whether you're just used to it. Have you figured it out for yourself? He looked out at the park. Marigold was calling something about a frog. I think I got lucky, he said. I didn't choose this life as much as it chose me, and it turned out to be the one I actually wanted. But I don't know if I'd have been smart enough to choose it on my own. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact he'd sat with long enough to be honest about. That's not a very inspiring answer. It's an honest one, Victoria said. I'd rather have that. Dad! Marigold was at the edge of the creek, pointing. Dad, there is a frog, and it is large. Is it threatening you? No, it's just large. Then admire it from a respectful distance. She turned back to the creek, and Logan turned back to his notebook. And Victoria sat on the bench with her hands in her pockets. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the noise in her head went quiet enough to hear the creek. Bartier. The calls she couldn't ignore started the following week. Marcus Webb was her CFO, had been for 4 years, and he called her on a Wednesday morning with the particular kind of careful cadence that meant he'd thought about this conversation before making it. The board wants a call, he said. They're framing it as a wellness check. I'm sure they are. Victoria, who called the meeting? Marcus? A pause. Daniels and Forsyth, but 3 others are on board, I think. Another pause. I think we have maybe 3 weeks before this becomes formal. She stood at the window of her rental, looking at the street below. What did Elliot tell them? The silence was just long enough. That's what I thought, she said. He may have had conversations with Daniels before you, but before I had surgery, she said. You can say it. Before you took your medical leave. About the direction of the company. About questions of long-term stability of leadership. Marcus's voice was measured and furious simultaneously, which was one of the things she'd always valued about him. He framed it carefully. He always does. She leaned against the window frame. Okay, I need everything. Every board communication since July, every filing. I need to know exactly what they think they have. I'll send it today. Marcus, she paused. Don't tell anyone where I am. I don't know where you are, he said, and she could hear that he understood exactly what she meant. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a long time. There it was. Not a surprise. She'd known since she arrived in Millhaven that the thing she was running from was still moving, was accelerating while she stood still. She'd known Elliot's departure was more than personal. She'd known something was coming. Knowing and facing it were 2 separate operations. She thought about Logan saying, "You're optimizing for the wrong variable," about his face when he'd said, "It's about whether you want something or you're just used to it," about Marigold standing at the creek saying sometimes things come out of hard things and they're actually better. She thought about the radiator she'd fixed herself. She opened her laptop and got to work. She and Logan fell into something that neither of them named. He took Marigold to the park most Saturdays, and Victoria started being at the park on Saturday mornings, and after a few weeks this stopped being coincidence. On a Thursday, in October, he'd stopped by her rental to help with a window that wouldn't latch. She'd asked by text, she'd saved his number in her phone the day he'd given her his, and the fact of this being normal now was something neither of them commented on. And he'd brought Marigold because his regular after-school coverage had fallen through, and Marigold had wandered through Victoria's rental with the calm confidence of a person who knew the rules of other people's spaces and was deciding whether to respect them. She'd settled on the couch with a book she'd found on Victoria's shelf, and she'd said, "Are you reading this because you have to or because you want to?" And Victoria had said, "I started it because I had to and now I want to." And Marigold had said, "That's the best kind of book," and opened it. Logan fixed the window in 20 minutes. They'd had dinner. Victoria had cooked, which she was adequate at and nothing more. And she'd been honest about that, and he'd not been polite about the overcooked pasta, which had somehow made it fine. "You hold the fork weird," Marigold told her at dinner. "Marigold," Logan said. "It's not wrong," Marigold said. "It's just different. My dad holds his pen weird, too. I think it means you taught yourself." Victoria looked at her fork. "I did, actually." "Me too," Logan said. "With the pen." He glanced at his daughter. "And you're still not supposed to comment on how people hold things." I was complimenting her. "That's a stretch." "It really is," Victoria agreed, and Marigold grinned at her, pleased, and kicked her feet under the chair. Later, when Marigold had fallen asleep on the couch, with her book open on her chest, Logan and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner between them and the kind of quiet that had become comfortable between them over weeks. "She's out," Logan said softly. "How do you do that?" "She was awake, and then she wasn't. She runs at one speed all day and then drops. Has since she was small." He was quiet, looking at his daughter in the other room. The look on his face was so plainly full of something. Love isn't quite the right word for it, because it's too small. It was more like certainty, like knowing that something is the most important thing in the world, and carrying that knowledge in every line of your body. That Victoria found herself looking away. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Do you ever—" She stopped, started again. "Do you ever feel like you disappeared into it, into being her father? Like there used to be a version of you that wanted other things and you don't remember where that person went?" Logan was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Not as often as I did. The first couple years were—" He exhaled. "They were hard in a way I couldn't have told you before they happened. It's all-consuming in a way that erases you for a while." He looked at his coffee. "But I think I came back. A different version, but I came back." "You don't seem like a man who disappeared," she said. He looked at her. It was a direct look, not searching, just present. "No," he said. "You seem like someone who's very specifically here." A pause. "You're working on something," he said, "for the company. I've seen the laptop open." It wasn't a question. She hadn't told him much, but she hadn't hidden the hours she'd been putting in over the past 2 weeks, the files, the legal documents she'd been reading with the attention of someone who knew that the interpretation of specific language was going to matter. "Yes," she said. "Is it bad?" "It might be." She was quiet. "Some people I trusted may have been doing things I didn't know about." While I was sick," she said. "Yes." He let that sit for a moment. He didn't offer anything she hadn't asked for. He didn't perform concern or try to solve it. He just sat there. And the quality of him sitting there was the quality she'd been unable to articulate since the park, since the diner, since the window that wouldn't latch. This solid, present, unhurried quality of a person who was actually in the room with you. "That's a lot to carry alone," he said. "I'm used to carrying things alone." "I know." A pause. "That doesn't mean you have to." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with the look she'd seen on people's faces when they said something like that, and meant it as a bid for something. He was just saying it. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." She looked down at the table. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Whatever this—" She made a gesture that took in the kitchen, the quiet apartment, his daughter asleep in the other room. "I've never had—" She stopped again, frustrated with herself. "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said. "I have a company that might be taken from me by people I should have watched more closely. I have—" She swallowed. "I had a person who left because he decided the version of me that came out of surgery wasn't the one worth staying for." And I am in a rented house in a town I didn't grow up in trying to figure out who I am without the things I built. Logan was quiet. Then, that's a lot of things to lose at once. Yes. Victoria. His voice was quiet. I'm not asking you to figure out what this is. I'm not asking you for anything. She looked at him. I just like... He paused. I just like knowing you. That's all I'm saying. She held his gaze for a moment. And then, for no reason she could articulate, and every reason she should have been able to, she felt something in her chest give way. Not break, not fall apart, but loosen. The way something tight and held too long loosens when you finally allow yourself to set it down. I like knowing you too, she said. Outside, the wind moved through the trees on the street, and inside, Marigold Reed slept on Victoria's couch with a book open on her chest, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The files Marcus sent filled 3 folders on her laptop, and she read through all of them that night after Logan took Marigold home. She made coffee at 10 o'clock, knowing she wouldn't sleep, sat at the kitchen table with the glow of the screen in the dark apartment, and started at the beginning. Board meeting minutes from August. Email chains she'd been CC'd on and some she hadn't. A memo from Gerald Daniels, her longest-serving board member, a man she'd brought in herself 5 years ago because she'd trusted his judgment, dated September 3rd, which was 2 weeks into her medical leave and 11 days before she'd arrived in Mill Haven. The memo was careful. Everything Gerald did was careful. That was what had made her trust him. It framed the question of leadership continuity as a matter of fiduciary responsibility. It used words like stability and shareholder confidence and long-term vision in the way that words can be used to mean something entirely different from what they say. Reading it, she felt the cold, specific feeling of recognizing that someone has been thinking something about you for a long time, and you have only just been given permission to see it. She read until 2 in the morning. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. What she had was not yet enough. That was the problem. She had a pattern, a shape of what had happened, but patterns weren't evidence and shapes weren't proof, and the people who'd done this were careful in the way of people who'd done careful things before. Gerald Daniels had not gotten to where he was by leaving fingerprints, but Elliot had. Elliot was many things, but he'd never had Gerald's particular gift for covering his tracks because he'd never needed it before. He was a corporate attorney who'd operated in rooms where everyone understood the subtext, where the unspoken thing was protected by professional courtesy and mutual interest. He'd never had to be careful in the way you needed to be careful when you were dealing with someone who'd spent 10 years learning exactly how deals fell apart. Victoria had spent 10 years learning exactly how deals fell apart. She went to bed at 2:30 and lay in the dark listening to the radiator she'd fixed herself, and she thought about what she needed and where to find it. She didn't mention any of this to Logan the following Saturday. It wasn't a conscious decision not to, or maybe it was, but not in the way of hiding something. More the way of knowing that the conversation required more than a morning in the park could hold, and she wasn't ready for the full weight of it in the open air. What she did instead was sit on the bench with coffee, while Marigold conducted what she was calling a scientific survey of the creek, which appeared to involve a notebook and a great deal of crouching. "She's going to fall in," Logan said. "She hasn't yet." The operative word being yet. He was watching his daughter with the half-attention of a parent who's learned which risks are real and which ones just look alarming. Her teacher called me Thursday. She wrote her entire history report about the ecological impact of urbanization on freshwater amphibian habitats. Victoria turned to look at him. How did she do? A minus. The teacher said she'd taken some liberties with the assigned topic, which was supposed to be about local community history, but the research was, quote, unexpectedly rigorous for a 3rd grader. That sounds about right. She's been telling everyone the Park Creek has 3 species of salamander and 2 species of frog. I can't confirm or deny any of this. I don't have the expertise. She's probably right, Victoria said. She's usually right about things she cares about. Logan looked at her sideways with the expression he got sometimes. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one. She likes you, he said. She doesn't like everyone. I know. I feel... She stopped because what she felt was something she didn't have a ready word for, something between moved and undeserving. "I feel lucky," she said, which was approximately right. Marigold had waded 6 inches into the creek and was staring at something near a rock with the focused concentration of a scientist or a predator. "Does she ask about her mother?" Victoria asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of the same place as many of the things she found herself saying around Logan, which was the place that was tired of calculating before speaking. Logan was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "less now than when she was 5 or 6. She went through a phase where she asked every few weeks." He looked at the creek. "I always tell her what's true, that her mom loved her but wasn't able to stay, and that it wasn't about her, that some people know their limits before you do." "Does she believe you?" "I think she believes that I believe it," he said, "which might be the most important part." Victoria turned this over. "Is that what you do believe?" He took a moment. "I think Claire made the right call for who she was," he said. "It's hard to hold that at the same time as knowing what Marigold lost. But they're both true." The ability to hold two true things at the same time that pulled in opposite directions. She'd noticed this in Logan, this particular capacity. She'd spent most of her adult life trying to resolve contradictions, to optimize, to find the one correct answer that invalidated the other. She was starting to understand it was a habit that had cost her things she hadn't noticed losing. "She asked me about you," Logan said, "last week." "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were going to stay." He said it simply, no particular weight applied to it. "She's old enough to know that people pass through. She wanted to know if you were one of those." Victoria looked at the creek. Marigold had her notebook out and was writing something with the deliberate care of someone documenting something important. "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know," Logan said. "Because I don't." She nodded. It was the honest answer, and she respected it, even as it sat in her chest with the particular weight of things you're not sure you've earned a different answer to. The following week, she drove to the city. She told herself it was to meet with Marcus in person, which was true. There were things easier to discuss face-to-face when you were trying to read someone, and she needed to read Marcus. But she also knew she was testing something, testing whether the city still felt like the place she belonged or whether it would feel the way she was afraid it might, like a costume she'd grown out of. It felt like both, which was its own kind of answer. Marcus met her at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Hale Industries offices, which she'd chosen specifically because it wasn't the kind of place board members went. He was 53 and had the careful, readable face of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where you paid for expressions. When he walked in and saw her, she watched him assess her the way she was assessing him. The particular mutual sizing up of people who trusted each other, and also understood that trust was something you maintained, not something you banked. "You look better than I expected," he said. "You expected worse." "I expected worse," he confirmed and sat down. "You read everything I sent?" "Everything. Tell me about the Forsyth meeting in August." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "That was the second one. The first one I didn't know about until after. Daniels, Forsyth, and Park. Private dinner, nothing on the calendar, no official minutes." He paused. "I found out from Park's assistant. She overheard something and she wanted me to know. She's been with us 6 years." "What did she hear?" "The phrase conditional restructuring," Marcus said. "And a name." He looked at her. Elliot's name. She'd known it was coming. She'd built the shape of it herself from the documents. And still, hearing it said out loud by someone else, the cold of it moved through her differently. "What do you think he offered them?" she said. "Access," Marcus said. "His firm has 3 clients who'd been circling a potential acquisition of our enterprise division for 2 years. We both know he knew that. He used to sit in on strategy meetings." His jaw tightened. He was in a unique position to know exactly which pressure points would accelerate a board challenge. "And in exchange?" "Advisory position, probably. Percentage on the acquisition if it goes through." Marcus looked at her steadily. "He's been careful. I can't prove the arrangement directly, but I have the timing, the communications between him and Forsyth going back to March." "March," she said. "March." She looked down at her coffee. March was 4 months before her surgery. 4 months before she'd lain in a hospital bed working out the mathematics of her own recovery, while the man she'd planned to marry was having conversations with her board members about what her company would look like without her in it. She sat with that for a moment and let it be what it was. "Okay," she said. "Victoria." "I'm fine." She looked up. "What's the timeline on the formal challenge?" "If they move at the next scheduled board meeting, you have 4 weeks, but Daniels has been known to call special sessions. I'd assume 3 weeks to be safe." "I need the full communication record between Elliott's firm and Forsyth going back to January. I need the Forsyth Park dinner itemized. Anything his assistant remembers, anything she saw. And I need the shareholder agreement language on Section 12, specifically the appointment clauses." Marcus was looking at her. "You have a plan." "I have the beginning of a plan." "Tell me." She talked for 40 minutes. He asked good questions and pushed back on 2 things, and she adjusted her thinking on one of them and held firm on the other. When she was done, he sat back and looked at her for a moment. "This is good," he said. "This could work." "It has to work," she said. "Because if it doesn't, I lose the company and they walk away clean and everything we built gets dismantled for parts." "There's something else," Marcus said. He said it in the tone of someone who's been waiting for the right moment. "Your filing deadline for the counterpetition. If you're going to challenge their standing to call a special session, you have a 7-day window from the date of formal notice." "I know the window." "The issue is the documentation. If we can't get the full communication record authenticated before the window closes." "I know." She picked up her cup and put it down again. "I'm working on that part." "Is there someone—" Marcus paused. "Is there someone helping you with this? You don't have to be doing this alone." She thought briefly and without meaning to, about a kitchen table and someone saying you don't have to carry things alone. She thought about what it meant that her mind went there. "I'm handling it," she said. "That's not the same thing as not being alone with it." "Marcus." "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." She looked at him. "I know." He nodded and let it go, which was one of the things she valued about him. He said the thing once and didn't repeat it. She drove back to Millhaven that evening and arrived after dark and sat in the parking lot of the rental for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the building with its lit windows and the tree on the sidewalk that had gone almost entirely orange now, October completing itself outside, while she'd been in the city holding her company's survival in her hands. She was tired. She was tired in a way that was different from the exhaustion she'd carried for years. Not the tired of too much work, which had always been livable, almost comfortable in its familiarity, but the tired of something more fundamental. The kind of tired that made you question whether you'd been spending the energy of your life in the right places. She went inside and made tea she didn't finish, and sat at the kitchen table looking at nothing, and the thought she kept coming back to, the one that surprised her, was not about the board meeting or the counterpetition or the 7-day window. It was about Logan and what he'd said about knowing when something was done, about the satisfaction of seeing when the seam was right. She'd never once in her career stopped to see if the seam was right. She'd always been already moving. The following Thursday, Logan showed up at her door unannounced for the first time. It was 6 in the evening, and she'd been in the same position at her kitchen table for 4 hours, surrounded by printed documents and 2 cold cups of coffee and the legal pad where she'd been charting the communication timeline. And when she heard the knock, she very nearly didn't answer it. He was standing on her porch with 2 bags of groceries. "I was at the store," he said. "I got extra." He looked at her face. "When did you last eat?" "I had—" She stopped. She'd had half a granola bar at noon. "I was working." "I can see that." He looked at the bags. "Do you want me to go?" She looked at him standing on her porch with his grocery bags and his canvas jacket and the uncomplicated way he'd shown up. "No," she said. "Come in." He made dinner without asking her what she wanted or performing any particular opinion about the state of her kitchen, which contained the evidence of several days of someone eating without paying attention to eating. He moved around the space with the practical ease of a man who cooked regularly and didn't require special conditions for it. Marigold was at his parents' tonight, he said. They did that every few weeks, and he'd found himself at the grocery store and thought of her, and it wasn't a complicated sequence of events. She cleared the papers from the kitchen table while he cooked, and she wasn't sure why she felt the specific relief of having another person in the space, the particular way the air in a room changes when someone else is breathing it. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know that," he said from the stove. She stopped. "I'm not easy right now. I'm working on something that's taking up most of my brain, and I'm not going to be good company." He looked over his shoulder. "Did I ask you to be good company?" "Logan?" "Victoria." He turned back to the stove. "Eat dinner with me and don't be good company. I don't actually require you to perform anything." She sat down. She wasn't sure she had the energy to argue with that. He made something with pasta and chicken and things from her refrigerator that she hadn't thought to combine, and it was better than anything she'd cooked in the past 3 weeks, and they ate at the kitchen table with the papers pushed to one side, and for a while neither of them said much, and she found it was not uncomfortable. "Okay," he said eventually. "Tell me about it. You don't have to, but you can." She looked at him. He was eating and not looking at her, giving her the option without pressing on it, so she told him. Not everything. She kept the sharpest details in her head, the things that weren't hers alone to share, but the shape of it. Her board. The challenge they were building. The fact that the man she'd been engaged to had been in conversations with her board members while she'd been recovering from surgery. Logan stopped eating. He set his fork down. He didn't say anything immediately, and she found she was grateful for that. Grateful that his first instinct wasn't to fill the space with something. "He knew when you were most vulnerable," Logan said. "Yes." And he chose that moment. "He'd been planning before it," she said. "That's the part that—" She stopped. "He had conversations with them going back to March. My surgery was July. So it wasn't that I got sick and he got scared and made a bad call in a bad moment. He'd already been—" She pressed her lips together. "He'd been building toward it before he even knew I was sick." Logan looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his face was plain and still, and she recognized in it the particular stillness of someone who has felt something strong and is holding it at a controlled distance. "That's different," he said. "Yes." "You loved him?" he said. It was not a question, just a statement of something true. "I did." She turned her fork over on the table. "I think I loved who I understood him to be. And I'm not sure those were the same person." Logan nodded slowly. He picked up his fork again. He wasn't offering to fix it, and he wasn't offering platitudes, and he wasn't asking her what she was going to do in the way of someone who needed a resolution to feel comfortable. He just sat with it, and she found herself for the second time in a month feeling something in her chest loosen. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The thing you're working on, the plan, does it work? Honestly?" "Honestly?" She considered. "If I can get the documentation authenticated before the deadline, yes. If the deadline passes without it, it's much harder." She paused. "There are things that depend on people doing what I need them to do in the right sequence. And are those people reliable?" "Most of them." She looked at him. "You're asking me real questions. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "Everyone else has been treating me like I'm delicate." "You're not delicate," he said. "You're dealing with a lot at once, which is different." The thing about Logan, the thing she kept turning over, kept trying to account for, was this quality of simply seeing what was actually there. No inflation, no reduction. He'd said early on that he wasn't interested in impressing her, and she'd registered it as a thing people said, but she understood now that it was just accurate. He wasn't interested in impressing her. He was interested in knowing her, which was entirely different, and she was beginning to understand considerably rarer. "Tell me about the bookcase," she said when they'd pushed the plates aside. "Did the cantilever work?" He looked at her for a moment, and then his face did the thing it did sometimes, the almost smile, the shape of something warm. "Yeah," he said. "It worked. I built the mock-up Tuesday." He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. The mock-up was rough, just bare wood, unfished, but you could see the structure of it. The seat was deep the way he'd wanted, and the shelves stepped back from it in the way she'd suggested, and the whole thing had the quality of something that had found its right form. "It's really good," she said. It's not done yet." "It's good right now." She handed the phone back. Sometimes things are good before they're finished. He took the phone back. His hand brushed hers in the exchange, and neither of them commented on it, and neither of them pulled back quickly, and for just a moment she was aware of the proximity, of how present he was, sitting across from her in her small kitchen in the evening light. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." She didn't know what she'd been going to say, or she knew, but she didn't know if she was allowed to say it yet. Didn't know if she'd earned the right to want what she was starting to want, or if she was far enough past the rubble of everything that had fallen to be thinking about what came next. "Nothing," she said. "Thank you for dinner." He looked at her for one moment more, then, "Any time," he said simply, the way he said most things, and it landed exactly as heavy as it was meant to. He helped her clear the table before he left. At the door he paused and turned back, and there was a moment where the evening sat between them, complete and unresolved the way real evenings are. And then he said goodnight and walked down the porch steps, and she stood in the doorway watching him go, and it occurred to her, not for the first time and more clearly than before, that she had come to Millhaven to recover from losing things and had not expected to find herself standing here wondering what it would mean to want something new. The street was quiet. The tree on the sidewalk had dropped most of its leaves. She went inside and went back to work, but the legal pad sat to one side of the laptop, and she found that the outline she'd been unable to untangle for 2 days had somehow cleared itself, and she could see the path through it now, and she wasn't certain whether that was because of anything he'd said or because of the simpler fact of not being alone in the room for a few hours. She decided it didn't matter which. She started writing. The documentation came through on a Tuesday, 5 days before the board's formal notice landed. Marcus sent it in 3 separate encrypted files, each one requiring a different passcode, which was the kind of caution that told her he'd understood exactly what he was holding. She opened them at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning with coffee she'd made right and actually drank while it was hot, which was something she'd started doing in Millhaven, the small reclamation of ordinary things. The files contained 4 months of communication between Elliot's firm and Richard Forsyth, emails, a document trail from a shared filing system that Elliot's paralegal had been using without understanding its metadata was preserved, and 3 calendar entries that placed Elliot and Forsyth in the same private meeting room on dates that corresponded exactly with the gaps she'd already identified in the pattern. She read through everything twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was enough. Not comfortable. Not the kind of case that would make opposing counsel laugh at the attempt. But enough. Enough to file. Enough to force a conversation that nobody on that board was going to want to have in front of the full shareholder body. She called Marcus. "I have it," she said. "I know," he said. "I sent it. I mean, I have enough." A pause. "How close?" "Close enough that Forsyth is going to want to settle before it gets to a full disclosure hearing. And if Forsyth moves, Daniels moves, because neither of them wants to be the one left holding the document trail alone." "And Elliot?" She looked at the legal pad on the table, at the timeline she'd charted over the past 2 weeks. Elliot's name appeared 11 times on it, each instance marked with a date and a corresponding document reference. "Elliot is a different conversation," she said. "How do you want to handle that one?" "I'll let you know when I figure it out." She looked out the window. The street was ordinary and quiet in the early morning. A neighbor walking a dog, the tree on the sidewalk with its last 3 leaves. "Book the shareholder room," she said. 2.5 weeks from today." "That's aggressive." "Yes," she said. "That's the point." After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the files still open on her laptop screen and tried to locate what she felt. She'd expected to feel something strong, relief, or the cold satisfaction of having outmaneuvered people who'd underestimated her. And those things were there, distantly. But what was closer to the surface was something she hadn't predicted. A weariness so specific it had an address, which was the place in her chest where the understanding lived that the people she'd caught in this documentation were people she'd chosen. She'd chosen Forsyth for that board seat. She'd chosen Daniels. She'd chosen Elliot for 4 years of her life. She'd chosen wrong. And the thing about choosing wrong wasn't the loss at the end of it. The loss was survivable, was in fact already being survived. The thing was the revision it required. Looking back at the choices you'd made and understanding that the judgment you'd trusted in yourself had missed something, had been measuring the wrong things. She'd spent her career being right. Being right had been the infrastructure everything else was built on. It turned out you could be right about most things, and wrong about the ones that cut closest to you, and the two truths sat side by side in a way that didn't resolve. She closed the laptop and went for a walk before she could think about it anymore. Logan's workshop was something she'd seen from the outside twice. The garage adjacent to his house, its windows lit in the evenings when she'd pulled into the driveway. But she hadn't been inside until the Saturday morning 3 weeks into October, when Marigold pulled her through the side door with the confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Dad said you can come see the bookcase," Marigold said. "The real one, not the mock-up." "She doesn't have to," Logan started from somewhere inside. "She wants to," Marigold said, with the authority of someone who'd already confirmed this with the interested party. She had not confirmed this with the interested party, but Victoria stepped inside and she was glad she did. The workshop smelled like wood shavings and linseed oil, and something underneath that she couldn't name but recognized as the smell of work that used the hands, real work, the kind that left evidence. It was organized in the way of spaces where someone actually used what was in them, not curated, not displayed, but everything having a place that made sense relative to the work. Tools on the pegboard in descending size order. Sawdust swept to the edges. 2 work lights positioned over the central bench, and on the central bench, the bookcase. It was different from the mock-up in the photo. The mock-up had been structure, the bones of the thing. This was the bones and the skin both. He'd used oak, she thought, with a finish that was still drying in sections, the wood warm and deep-grained in the workshop light. The seat of the built-in base was upholstered with something she didn't recognize, a fabric in a gray-green that had the quality of having been chosen carefully by someone who knew it mattered even if nobody would say so. She stopped. "Logan, that's beautiful." He was standing to the side with a cloth in his hand, the particular stance of someone who'd been working and had only recently stopped. He looked at the bookcase the way he looked at it in a way she'd seen before. Not proud exactly, more evaluative, more like someone checking whether it had become what they'd intended. "The finish is still uneven on the left side," he said. "I need another coat." "I know," she said. "It's still beautiful." "She always says that," Marigold told her, appearing from somewhere deeper in the workshop. "When something's not done and he says it's not done yet." "She?" "My grandma. She comes and looks at stuff while Dad's working. She always says it's beautiful, and he always says it's not done yet." Marigold climbed up onto a stool at the edge of the bench. "I think you're both right." Logan looked at his daughter. "When did you get so diplomatic?" "I'm not diplomatic, I'm accurate." "There's a difference?" "Diplomatic is when you say something nice. Accurate is when you say something true that happens to be nice." She appeared satisfied with this distinction. "Ms. Fortini says I have a talent for nuance." "Ms. Fortini and I need to have a talk," Logan said, but his voice was the kind of flat that meant he was trying not to smile. Victoria ran her hand along the edge of the bookcase seat. The seam between the upholstered cushion and the wood base was precise, each thing ending exactly where it should. "What's it for?" she asked. "Is it commissioned?" "It was supposed to be," Logan said. "Couple in Claremont. They wanted it for their reading room, but they moved in August. House fell through. They canceled the order." He shrugged. "I kept building it." "Why?" He looked at it. "Because I'd already figured out how to make it right," he said. "Felt wrong to stop." She understood that. She understood it in the way you understand something that isn't about furniture at all. "Where will it go?" "I'll probably sell it, or—" He paused. "I don't know yet." Marigold, who had been examining something at the back of the workshop, appeared suddenly beside Victoria. "Dad's going to keep it," she said. "He always says he'll sell the ones he really likes, and then he keeps them." "I sell plenty of things I like." "Name one thing you kept that you didn't mean to." A pause. "The chair in the living room," Marigold said before he could answer. "And the side table in my room, and the lamp base in the hallway." She said this with the satisfaction of someone presenting a carefully prepared argument. 3 things. 3 is not a pattern. 3 is absolutely a pattern. Victoria laughed. She'd been doing that more in this workshop, in this house, in proximity to these two people, laughing the unguarded way, the way that caught her before she'd planned for it. It was, she was discovering, both the easiest and the strangest thing about being around them. Logan looked at her when she laughed and she caught it, just the edge of it, the quick thing that moved across his face before he looked away. It wasn't nothing. She was not misreading it, and she understood in the way she was getting better at understanding things she'd spent years not paying attention to, that he wasn't misreading what was on her face either. They just hadn't said it out loud yet. The formal notice from the board arrived on a Thursday. She'd known it was coming. Marcus had warned her with 2 days lead time. But there's a difference between knowing something is coming and holding it in your hands. And she sat with the email open on her laptop for a long moment before she started processing what it meant practically. Special session, 19 days. The language was formal and careful, and beneath the formality, she could read Daniels' specific fingerprint, the way he'd selected which board member signatures appeared first, the ordering of the stated concerns, the particular word choice in the section about leadership continuity. She'd been in enough rooms with Gerald Daniels to know how he arranged language when he wanted something to look inevitable. She filed the counter petition that afternoon. Marcus handled the submission, but she'd written the core document herself over the previous 2 weeks, and she sat at her kitchen table while he confirmed receipt and felt something she recognized as the particular calm that came when there was nothing left to plan, only to execute. Then she called Elliot. She hadn't planned to call him. She'd decided, in the rational planning she'd been doing, that any communication with him should go through legal channels, that there was nothing to be gained from direct contact and several things to be lost. This was correct. She called him anyway. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting it. "Victoria," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered. She'd loved this voice. She'd found it reassuring in the particular way that competent people's voices can be reassuring, the quality of someone who always knew what they were about to say next. She sat with that for a moment. "I filed today," she said. A pause. "I know. My firm received the notification this morning. I want you to know I have everything, Elliot. The communication record, the calendar overlap, the document trail from the shared filing system your paralegal didn't know was preserving metadata." She kept her voice level. "I want you to know that I'm going into that shareholder meeting in 19 days with every piece of it." Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you want from this call?" he said. "Nothing," she said. And it was true. She wasn't calling to negotiate or to threaten, wasn't calling to hear him confess or apologize. She didn't need either. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "I wanted to not be the person who found out while sitting in a hospital bed for once. I wanted to be the one who told you something instead." The silence stretched. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said honestly. "Not as much as it would have been if you hadn't done it, but something." She took a breath. "Goodbye, Elliot." She hung up and set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a while. The apartment was quiet in the way it always was in the afternoons, before the town started its small evening sounds. She could hear the creak from here if she opened the window. She left the window closed and just sat in the quiet and let the call be over. She didn't cry. She thought she might, but she didn't. What she felt instead was something much simpler and much harder to articulate, a finalness. Not relief, not peace. Just the particular feeling of a door closing that you've been looking at for a long time while it was still technically open. She opened her laptop and got back to work. That night she was still at the table at 10:30 when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Logan. "Lights on. You okay?" She looked at the text. She looked at the window where she could see, at the edge of her view, the faint glow of the workshop across the lot. He was working late too. "Long day," she typed. "You're working late." Finishing the second coat. "The left side was bothering me." She almost typed that it wasn't worth losing sleep over, but she stopped herself because she understood that for him it was not in the anxious way, but in the way of someone who knew the difference between right and not quite right, and couldn't leave the not quite right one standing. The filing went through, she typed instead. A pause. Then, do you want company? She looked at the phone. She looked at the table with its papers and the cold coffee and the window with the dark outside it. Yes, she typed. If you're not too tired, give me 20 minutes. He arrived in 25 with 2 cups of coffee from the machine in his workshop that she'd learned made better coffee than she'd expected, and he was wearing paint-stained jeans and a flannel that had clearly been through a great many things, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and set one of the cups in front of her. How'd it feel? He asked. Filing? Correct, she said. It felt correct. Not good? Correct and good aren't always the same thing. She wrapped her hands around the cup. I called Elliot. Logan looked at her. He didn't ask why. He just waited. I needed to be the one holding the information for once, she said. I needed him to know I had it and that I wasn't afraid of it. She paused. I don't know if that was strategic. It wasn't, probably. It was just something I needed. Did it help? She considered. It closed something, she said. I think I needed it to be closed. Logan nodded, slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, she could hear the particular quality of the house around them. The small sounds of old wood settling, the distant sound of a car on the road outside. My dad didn't speak to his brother for 11 years, Logan said. Over money, over the family business, over things that happened when they were young that neither of them could agree on how to remember. He turned his coffee cup. When his brother got sick, my dad drove 4 hours to see him. They talked for 2 days, and then his brother died, and afterward my dad said he didn't know if the conversation had fixed anything, but he knew he'd needed to have it. She looked at him. What did he think it was worth? He said he thought it was worth knowing he'd shown up. Logan looked at the table. Not for his brother exactly, for himself. For being the kind of person who shows up when it matters. She sat with that. It was not a perfect analogy. The situations were different in the ways that mattered. But the thing at the center of it was recognizable. The idea of doing something not because it would work out, but because you needed to know you'd done it. Thank you, she said, for telling me that. Sure. He looked up. You want to tell me about the meeting? So she did. She laid it out in more detail than she had before. Not all of it. She was still protecting Marcus and the people who'd helped her who hadn't consented to having their roles discussed. But the framework, the counterpetition, the documentation, what she believed would happen when Forsyth saw what she had, the way the board dynamic would shift when one of them blinked. Logan listened the way he always listened, which was fully and without performing attention. He asked 2 questions. Both were good ones, the kind that didn't come from understanding corporate law, but from understanding people. How Forsyth would weigh personal risk against loyalty to Daniels, whether the other board members would follow or lead if the situation shifted. You know what you're doing, he said when she'd finished. I know what I'm doing when it's working, she said. It's different when you're in the middle of it. You lose, she paused. You lose the view. You start second-guessing the things you're most sure of because you're too close to them. Then don't be too close, he said. Tell me again. She looked at him. What? Tell me the case, like I'm a shareholder who doesn't know you and doesn't like you particularly, and you have to convince me in 15 minutes. He leaned back. Go. She stared at him. Logan, I'm serious. You said you lose the view, so use me for the view. She was quiet for a moment. And then she started talking, and this time she talked differently. She stripped the feeling out of it, addressed him like a stranger, made the case from the structure rather than from the inside of it. He sat across from her and listened with the particular focused expression she'd come to recognize. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The Forsyth communication record, he said. You said the metadata preserved the dates. Yes. How do you explain that to someone who doesn't know what metadata is? She thought about it. I say the files kept a record of when they were created and who created them, the way a receipt has a timestamp. He nodded. Use that. The receipt thing. People understand receipts. She wrote it down on the legal pad. The argument about shareholder value, he continued. You said the acquisition would dismantle the enterprise division. What does that mean for the average person who owns stock? It means short-term gain, long-term devaluation. They'd see an initial spike, and then, don't say devaluation, Logan said. Say what it actually means, in words. She looked at him. He was right. It means they'd get a check today, and in 3 years the check would have been worth more if they'd waited. That's your argument, Logan said. That's the whole thing right there. She wrote that down too. They sat like that for another hour. Him asking blunt, unsophisticated questions from outside the expertise, and her being forced to answer them in language that didn't require the expertise to understand. It was, she recognized, the most useful hour of preparation she'd had. Not because he knew anything about corporate governance, but because he didn't. And the people in that room who'd decide this weren't all Gerald Daniels. Some of them were people who wanted to understand what they were voting on. At midnight, he stood up to go, and she walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway in the same way they'd stood before. The same quality of unfinished evening between them. Logan, she said. He stopped. He was on the porch step, one level below her, which put them closer to the same height than usual, and in the porch light she could see his face clearly. I need to say something, she said, and I don't know if the timing is... She stopped, started again. I'm in the middle of something, I know that. I know this isn't the right moment for anything else to be complicated. Okay, he said, waiting. But I'm aware, she said. I need you to know I'm aware of... She made a small gesture that was inadequate for what she meant. Of this. Of whatever this is. He looked at her for a moment. He didn't move, didn't close the distance, didn't perform anything. I know, he said. I don't want you to think I'm... Victoria. His voice was quiet. I know. She looked at him. The honesty of his face in the porch light. The complete absence of agenda in it. Okay, she said. When this is done, he said, when you've done what you need to do, we'll figure out the rest of it. You sound very certain about that. He almost smiled. I'm certain about some things, he said. This is one of them. She wanted to ask him how someone got that certain, how you stood at the edge of something unmapped and felt sure rather than afraid. But she didn't ask because she thought she might already know the answer. You got certain the same way you got a bookcase, right? You kept working on it until the seam was where it was supposed to be, and you didn't stop because it wasn't finished yet. Good night, Logan, she said. Good night. He stepped off the porch. He was halfway down the path when he stopped and looked back. Victoria. Yes. You're going to win, he said, simply, plainly, with the quality of a man reporting something he believed without ornamentation. Just so you know. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk back across the lot toward the lit windows of his workshop, and she stayed there until the cold air made the decision for her, and then she went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment. She was going to fight for the company she'd built. She was going to win. And standing in a rented kitchen in a small town where her grandmother used to live, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the adrenaline of a deal closing or the relief of a number landing right, but something quieter and more durable than both of those. She felt like she was going to be okay. Not because the meeting was 19 days away and she had the documentation and the counterpetition was filed. Those things were true and they mattered. But she felt okay for a different reason, one she was only beginning to know how to measure. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and she slept. Outside, across the lot, the workshop light burned for another hour before it went off. The 19 days moved the way time moves when you have too much to do and too much to feel simultaneously, some of it fast, some of it unbearably slow, none of it quite matching the speed you needed. Victoria had driven back to the city the Monday after filing because there were things she could no longer manage from a distance. She kept the rental in Mill Haven. She'd paid through the end of November, and she didn't give it up, which was a decision she made without examining it too closely because she understood that some decisions survive scrutiny better before you make them than after. Her city apartment felt like a hotel. She'd lived in it for 3 years, and it had always been beautiful and correct, and it had never quite felt like a place someone lived in, a fact she was only now noticing. She stood in the kitchen the first night back and looked at the clean surfaces and the art she'd chosen with the help of a designer and the view she'd paid for. and she thought about a rented kitchen with papers on the table and 2 coffee cups and the sound of a creak if you opened the window. She didn't open this window. What she did was work. The counterpetition had bought her time and established the framework, but the shareholder meeting was where it would actually be decided. And there's a difference between having the evidence and making the evidence land. She spent the first week back in meetings with Marcus and their legal team. A woman named Priya Sood, who'd been their outside counsel for 2 years and who had the gift of being exactly as alarmed as the situation warranted. No more and no less, which Victoria found enormously useful. The metadata authentication is solid, Priya said at their second meeting. I'm less concerned about that than I am about Daniels' standing argument. He's going to try to establish procedural grounds before the evidence even enters the room. I know, Victoria said. That's what I'd do. He'll argue the counterpetition itself is out of order, that the filing window was conditional on receipt of formal written notice, and that the email notification doesn't satisfy the written notice requirement in Section 8. He's wrong about that. The 2019 amendment to the shareholder agreement explicitly updated the definition of written notice to include electronic communication. He knows he's wrong, Priya said. He's not doing it to win the procedural argument. He's doing it to eat 15 minutes at the top of the meeting while people are still settling in. Victoria looked at her. Then we have a prepared response, and we deliver it in 3 minutes, and we move on. Agreed. Priya looked at her notes. What about Forsyth? Forsyth is going to fold, Victoria said. Maybe not before the meeting, but during it. Once he sees the full document set laid out in sequence, he's going to understand that his name is on too many of those pages to survive a disclosure hearing. He'll want a conversation. She paused. Let him want it. Don't give him the conversation before we're in the room. And Park? Park followed Daniels into this, and she knows it. She's not going to fall on a sword for Gerald Daniels. Victoria had met Christine Park 8 times. She was a precise, self-preserving woman who'd made her name in risk management, which meant she understood exposure better than almost anyone else on that board. When Forsyth moves, she'll move the same direction. Marcus had been quiet through most of this, which was how she knew he was thinking hard. He looked up from his notes. What about the shareholders who aren't board members? The ones who'll be in that room and don't know any of this is coming? They know something is coming, Victoria said. The special session itself is the signal. Nobody calls a special session for good news. She thought about Logan asking her to talk through the case like he was a stranger who didn't know her. The argument isn't complicated, she said. They conspired to remove leadership during a medical leave. They used privileged access, specifically access provided by someone with a personal relationship to the CEO, to do it. And the acquisition they were positioning for would have created short-term value for a small number of people and long-term devaluation for everyone else in that room. She looked at Marcus. People understand when someone's trying to take what isn't theirs. Marcus nodded slowly. That's the argument. That's the whole argument, she said. She called Logan most evenings. She hadn't planned that either. It had started practically. She'd needed to talk through the receipt metaphor he'd suggested, had wanted to test it against another conversation, and she'd called him on a Wednesday and they'd spent 40 minutes on the phone, and at the end of it she'd felt the same thing she felt after, the late nights at her kitchen table in Mill Haven, which was the loosening, the quiet after the noise. By the second week it was just how her evenings ended. He was good on the phone. He didn't fill silence that didn't need filling, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. He'd tell her about the workshop. He was building a dining table now, commissioned by a family in town, and he had strong opinions about the joinery method that she had no context for and found herself genuinely interested in anyway. She'd tell him about the preparation. He'd ask the blunt questions she needed, and she'd answer them in the language she was rehearsing. Once, on a Thursday night when she'd been going over the procedural section for the 3rd time, and her brain had started returning the same result regardless of input, he'd said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with the meeting." She'd paused. Like what? Anything. What did you have for dinner? She looked at the takeout container on the counter. Pad Thai. Was it good? It was fine. It was from the place on 7th. The one on 7th with the orange awning? She frowned at the phone. How do you know the one on 7th? Danny went to the city for a conference last year and he talked about the Pad Thai on 7th for 2 weeks afterward. He has very strong feelings about Pad Thai. It's adequate Pad Thai. I'll tell him you said that. He'll be devastated. Don't tell him I said that. He'll be fine. He's very resilient. A pause. Marigold wants to know if you found any more salamanders before you left. She looked at her city apartment, its clean surfaces, its view. I didn't get back to the creek, she said. I'll tell her the salamanders are waiting. She laughed. The genuine kind, the kind that still caught her sideways sometimes. Tell her I'm working on it. She made you something, actually, he said. It's sitting on my kitchen counter. She painted it at school. She doesn't know I told you, so act surprised. What is it? It's a salamander on a creek rock, or possibly a lizard on a regular rock. The proportions are... He paused. She worked very hard on it. I'm sure it's wonderful, she said. I'm sure it is too, he agreed, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it, that he genuinely believed his daughter's salamander painting was wonderful in the way that mattered, which was the only way. She sat on her kitchen floor. She'd slid down from the counter at some point during the conversation, which she didn't notice until she was already there, and said, Logan. Yeah. Thank you for calling me. I mean, I called you, but thank you for picking up. I pick up? He said simply. I know. She looked at the ceiling. I'm starting to count on it. A pause. Good, he said. The same quiet delivery of certainty he always had. The same absence of drama around things he clearly felt. That's the idea. She went to bed that night at an actual hour, and she didn't dream about anything. And in the morning she felt ready in a way she hadn't the morning before. Marigold arrived in her life like a weather system. It wasn't one event. It was the accumulation of small things over the weeks, the texture of someone becoming part of your thinking. Victoria found herself noting, at random points in her day, things she'd want to tell her. An article about a new study on amphibian habitats in urban waterways. A documentary she'd seen referenced in a magazine. The fact that the building across from her office had a family of pigeons nesting in a window box that Marigold would have opinions about. She bought the field guide on a Wednesday from a bookshop near her office. A proper one, comprehensive, with illustrations and regional breakdowns, the kind of book you could use to actually identify things. She wasn't sure when she'd give it to her. She bought it anyway. When she was 12, she'd had a teacher, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, 7th grade science, who'd handed her a book once with no explanation, just set it on her desk and walked away. It was a book about structural engineering, which had nothing to do with 7th grade science, but Mrs. Calloway had apparently noticed something and acted on it, and Victoria had read the book in 4 days. She'd never told Mrs. Calloway what that had meant because she hadn't known how, and Mrs. Calloway had moved to a different school the following year. She thought about that a lot in the weeks before the meeting, about things that are noticed and things that are acted on, about the difference between seeing something in a person and doing something about it. Marigold was 8, and she paid attention to living things, and she had opinions, and she didn't wait for permission to know things. She was, Victoria was discovering, very easy to love. This was both straightforward and complicated, because the things that are easy to love are also the things you can lose, and she had a reliable history of losing things. She thought about that. She thought about Logan saying, I choose you, without flinching, not in those words, not yet, but in the accumulation of showing up and picking up and making dinner and sitting at the kitchen table asking blunt questions she needed someone to ask. She thought about what it would mean to trust that. She wasn't there yet. She knew she wasn't there yet, but she was closer than she'd been, and the direction felt right. And for someone who'd been questioning her own direction for months, right was a significant thing to feel. 9 days before the meeting, Richard Forsyth called Marcus. Marcus called Victoria 2 minutes later. She was in a meeting with Priya that she stepped out of without explanation. He wants to talk, Marcus said. I know. He's framing it as wanting to understand the full picture before the session. He used the phrase, explore common ground. There is no common ground, she said. What he wants is to see if I'll settle before it gets to the room. Are you considering it? She stood in the hallway outside the conference room. Through the glass, she could see Priya reviewing documents with the focused expression of someone who knew what a settlement conversation meant. No, she said. Victoria. If I settle, it doesn't end. It creates a precedent that I can be moved when the pressure is sufficient. Daniels will know that. Anyone else who's watching will know that. She kept her voice even. We go to the room. We put it in front of the shareholders. We let them decide. A pause. He's going to make this ugly, Marcus said. He'll try to make it about your health. Let him. She looked at the window at the end of the hallway. The city below, gray and busy. I'm not hiding from my health. I had surgery, and I recovered, and I'm standing here. He can try to make that into a liability in front of the people who own stock in a company I built before I was 30. She paused. Let him try. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Tell Forsyth that if he wants to explore common ground, he can do it in the meeting room in 9 days. He's not going to like that. I know, she said. He's not supposed to. She went back into the meeting. 6 days before, she drove back to Millhaven for a weekend. She wasn't sure exactly why she needed to, except that the city had started to feel like something she was working inside rather than living inside, and she needed to feel like a person rather than a function for a couple of days. She called Logan from the road, and he said, "Come have dinner." And she said she'd bring something, and he said, "Don't worry about it." And she stopped at a bakery in town anyway because she was not capable of arriving at someone's house with nothing. She arrived at 6:30 with a pie she hadn't baked herself. The sign in the bakery window had said honey apple, and she'd stood in front of it for approximately 0 seconds before deciding. Marigold opened the door before she'd knocked. "Dad said you were coming at 6, she said, with the air of someone who'd been monitoring this situation. "I said around 6, Logan called from somewhere inside. "Not at 6. "Around 6 means at 6, Marigold told Victoria, as if this were self-evident. Her eyes went to the pie box. "What's that?" "Honey apple pie from the bakery on Main. The one with the green door? Is there another one?" "There's one by the gas station, but Dad says it's only okay." She stepped back to let Victoria in with the authority of someone who lived here and was choosing to extend the invitation. "Dad likes honey apple." "I know," Victoria said, and then realized she did know. She'd registered it once in passing conversation, 3 weeks ago, some comment about what his mother made for his birthday. She'd retained it without trying to. Logan appeared from the kitchen in a flannel with a dish towel over his shoulder, and he looked at the pie box and then at her, and the look on his face was the same one he had in the workshop, the same quality of something being in the right place. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "Green Door Bakery." "Good choice." He took the box. "Marigold, go wash your hands." "I already did." "Again." She went. He looked at Victoria in the entryway. "How are you?" "Tired," she said honestly. "But okay, the good kind of tired." "There's a good kind." "When you're tired because you did what you needed to do, instead of tired because you've been dreading it." She handed him her coat. "That's the good kind." They ate at the kitchen table, and it was not elegant, and it was not quiet. Marigold had strong opinions about the documentary she'd watched in school about migratory birds, which led to a debate about whether migration counted as a form of intelligence, which led to Logan arguing that most intelligent things looked simple from the outside, which led to Marigold asking Victoria whether her company did any intelligent-looking simple things. "Most of what looks simple from the outside isn't," Victoria said. "That's usually the goal, to do something complicated well enough that nobody sees the complicated part." "Like magic tricks," Marigold said. "A little like magic tricks, yes." "Is that what you're doing at the meeting? A magic trick?" "Marigold," Logan said. "I'm curious." "You can be curious without interrogating guests." "She's not a guest," Marigold said, with the certainty of someone stating an established fact. "She's Victoria." The kitchen was quiet for just a moment. Victoria looked at Marigold, who was eating her dinner with the complete focus of someone who'd said a true thing and seen no reason to make it strange. Logan was looking at his plate. "No," Victoria said to Marigold's question. "It's not a magic trick. It's more like evidence, showing people what's actually there and trusting that they'll see it. What if they don't?" "Then I'll say it more clearly," Victoria said. "Until they do." Marigold appeared satisfied with this. "Okay," she said. "Can we have pie now?" They had pie. It was good. The honey flavor was not too sweet. The apples still had texture. The crust had the quality of something made by someone who knew what they were doing. Logan had 2 pieces without apologizing for it, which was the kind of thing Victoria noticed now, these small, uncomplicated ways that people inhabited themselves. After dinner, Marigold disappeared to her room with the unilateral decision of someone who'd assessed that the adults needed a minute, which was either very perceptive or a complete coincidence, and probably the former. They sat at the table with the remains of the pie between them, and the kitchen had the specific quality Victoria associated now with this house. Warm and slightly imperfect and fully inhabited, the opposite of her apartment in the city. "She called you Victoria," Logan said, "not a guest." "I heard. Does that—" He paused. "Is that okay?" She looked at him. "It's more than okay," she said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over on the table. "She asked me," he said, "last week. She asked if you were going to be around more." "What did you say?" "I said I thought so." He looked up. "Was that wrong?" "No," she said. "That wasn't wrong." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked back at the table, and she was grateful that he didn't try to make it more than what it was in this moment. This modest and real thing of 2 people sitting at a kitchen table with honey apple pie and a child upstairs, and the particular knowledge between them that something was settling into place. It didn't need to be stated to be real. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. She'd known she wouldn't be able to, had not even bothered pretending she would. Just lay in her city apartment in the dark, going over the sequence of events that would begin at 9 the next morning. She'd done this preparation. The documentation was authenticated and indexed. Priya had prepared the response to the procedural challenge. Marcus had the room logistics. She knew what she was walking into. Knowing and facing it were still 2 separate operations. At 2 in the morning, her phone lit up. A text from Logan. "Still up?" She almost laughed. She typed back, "Yes. You?" "Marigold had a nightmare. She's asleep again." "I'm not." What was her nightmare about? A very large salamander. She was upset that it wouldn't let her study it. "That's the most Marigold nightmare I've ever heard." She settled when I told her the salamander was probably just shy. Victoria lay in the dark with the phone on her chest. Outside her window, the city was doing what the city did at 2 in the morning, which was never fully stop. Logan. "Yeah, I'm scared." She hadn't planned to say that. She hadn't said it out loud to anyone, hadn't let herself say it in any of the preparation, any of the case building, any of the long evenings with Marcus and Priya. She'd been focused and strategic and occasionally furious, and she had not, until this moment, said the plain and simple thing underneath all of it. Her phone buzzed. "I know," Logan wrote. "That's okay." She looked at those 4 words for a long time. What if I lose? A pause. She could imagine him in his kitchen, probably standing at the counter, the house quiet around him. "Then you come back here," he wrote, "and we figure out what comes next, together." She read that once. She read it again. "You can't promise that," she typed. "I just did." She lay in the dark for a while after that. The city outside was still loud and constant, indifferent the way cities are. She thought about a park bench by a creek, and a woman sitting still for a long time, and a child who noticed things, and a man who showed up with groceries and asked blunt questions, and fixed windows and picked up the phone. She thought about what it meant that she'd driven back to Millhaven 6 days before the most important professional confrontation of her life. Not to strategize, but to sit at a kitchen table and eat pie and hear a child say she wasn't a guest. She thought about what she was fighting for tomorrow, and what she'd found while she was fighting for it. She texted him, "Good night, Logan." He wrote back, "Go win." She set the phone on the nightstand and closed her eyes, and this time, for a few hours, she slept. She was up at 5:30 without an alarm. Not the anxious kind of awake, not the kind where your heart is already running before your mind catches up. It was the quieter kind, the kind where you've been waiting for a day long enough that your body decides to stop pretending to sleep and simply get ready. She made coffee and stood at her kitchen window, watching the city in the dark. The way it started its engine before dawn, delivery trucks and lit office windows, and the particular gray that comes before the sky decides what color it's going to be. She thought about her grandmother's house on Birch Street, about the kitchen that smelled like cardamom, and the window that looked out on a yard that was never quite tamed, and about being 9 years old and feeling, for reasons she couldn't have articulated then, that this was what safe felt like. She hadn't known she was filing that away. She hadn't known she'd need it 30 years later as a reference point. She got dressed carefully and without particular vanity. The charcoal suit she'd worn to the last investor presentation, the one that had been described in a business publication as authoritative, which she'd found both accurate and slightly exhausting as a thing to be described as. She put her hair up. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the kind of look where you're not checking your appearance but making sure someone is home. Someone was home. She picked up her bag and went. Us. The shareholder meeting room was on the 14th floor of the Hale Industries building, a space she'd used dozens of times for dozens of purposes, and it looked exactly as it always looked. The long table, the chairs, the projector screen, the windows with their reliable city view. Familiar in the way that something can be familiar and feel entirely different depending on what you're carrying into it. Marcus was already there when she arrived at 8:15. He was standing by the coffee setup on the side credenza, and when he turned and saw her, something moved across his face that she would categorize as relief, though he composed it quickly. "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said. "Where's Priya?" "On her way up. She got here 10 minutes ago. She went back to the car for something." He handed her a coffee. "Forsyth's assistant called this morning." "And?" "He's coming. He didn't pull out." Marcus looked at her. "That's actually good." "I know." She'd been monitoring this possibility, that Forsyth would call in sick, cite a conflict, find some reason to be absent that would delay the session and buy time for a different strategy. "He's coming because he thinks he still has leverage," she said. "He doesn't, but he thinks he does." "Daniels is already here," Marcus said. "He came in at 8. He's in the small conference room with his attorney." "Of course he is." She looked at the room, at the seats, at the screen. "How many shareholders confirmed?" 47 direct, about 60 proxies. A few more might come in person." He paused. "It's a good room, Victoria. Most of these people built with you." "Most," she said. "Most is enough." Priya came in at 8:30 with her briefcase and the brisk, organized energy of someone who'd slept well and eaten breakfast and was genuinely unafraid of difficult rooms. She and Victoria ran through the sequence one more time, not because they needed to, but because the run-through was its own kind of steadying, the way athletes move through a routine before they perform it for real. At 8:55, people started coming in. She stood at the front of the room, and she greeted each person by name, and she meant it. These were people she knew, people who'd believed in what she was building at various stages of it, people who'd taken calls from her at odd hours, and reviewed documents she'd sent at midnight. Not all of them liked her. Liking wasn't the point. They knew her work, and she knew theirs. Gerald Daniels came in at 8:58. She hadn't seen him since July. He was 64 and silver-haired and had the manner of someone who'd spent 4 decades in boardrooms and learned to wear them like a second skin. He looked at her when he came in and she watched him assess. The quality of her composure, the positioning, the fact that she was standing at the front of the room rather than seated, which he'd understand as intentional. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Richard Forsyth came in behind him, which told her they'd coordinated their entrance, and she registered this as the information it was. Christine Park came in alone, sat on the left side of the table, and did not look at Daniels. Also information. At 9 o'clock, she called the meeting to order. Daniels made his procedural move at 9:04, which was faster than she'd expected, but exactly the shape she'd expected. He raised the written notice question with the measured authority of someone who'd rehearsed the argument but wanted it to look spontaneous. His attorney, a compact man in a gray suit, had a brief ready. Victoria let him finish. She let the brief be entered. She counted to 3. "The 2019 amendment to the shareholder agreement, Section 8, Paragraph 4, she said. Electronic communication satisfying the authentication requirements of Paragraph 7 constitutes written notice for all purposes under this agreement." She looked at Daniels, not at his attorney. "Our filing satisfies those requirements. The authentication record is in your supplemental packet, tab 3. She paused. "Are there further procedural concerns?" Silence. "Then we'll proceed," she said. It was not a dramatic moment, but she saw Marcus exhale at the side of the room, and she saw Forsyth shift in his chair, and she saw Christine Park press her pen to the notepad in front of her without writing anything, which was the body language of someone making a private note to herself about which way this was going. She presented for 28 minutes. She'd known, going in, the 28 minutes was approximately the span of sustained attention she could count on from a room of people who'd been told they were coming to a meeting about leadership governance. She'd built the presentation to that constraint, not dumbed down, not simplified past accuracy, but structured so that the most important things landed at the beginning, and the end and the middle was the connective tissue that made the outer pieces undeniable. She used the receipt metaphor. It worked exactly the way Logan had said it would. She watched 3 people in the room relax slightly when she used it, the way you relax when something complicated becomes suddenly clear. She put the document trail on the screen. She walked through the timeline. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't perform outrage, and she didn't ask the room to feel anything in particular about what they were seeing. She just showed them what was there. Gerald Daniels was very still throughout. Richard Forsythe was not. She'd watched people under pressure in rooms like this before, and she knew the difference between stillness that was confident and stillness that was controlled. And she knew that Forsythe's hands on the table in front of him were doing something complicated that his face was trying to override. He'd been in those documents. He'd seen the documents before this meeting. She'd had Priya send the supplemental packet 24 hours in advance, which was technically more notice than required, but she'd wanted him to have time to understand exactly how much she had. She'd wanted him to come into this room already knowing. He knew. When she finished and opened the floor, the first question came from a woman named Dorothea Lim, who'd been a shareholder since year 2 and who had the reputation of asking the questions other people were too polite to ask. "Ms. Hale," Dorothea said, "the communication between board member Forsythe and the outside attorney. You've established the timeline and the content. What are you alleging specifically?" "I'm not alleging," Victoria said. "I'm presenting documented evidence that board members coordinated with an outside party, a party with direct access to proprietary strategic information obtained through a personal relationship with company leadership, to pursue a change in corporate control that would have materially benefited their external business interests." She kept her voice level. "I'm presenting that to you as shareholders. What you do with it is your decision. What are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to vote against the special resolution that prompted this meeting," she said, "and I'm asking you to authorize an independent review of the conduct documented in this packet." Dorothea nodded once. "Thank you." The second question was from a man named Paul Greaves, who'd been vocal in earlier quarters about operational strategy, and who was not, Victoria knew, in her camp automatically. "Ms. Hale," he said, "your medical leave was 2 months. The concern raised by the board, legitimate or otherwise, was about leadership continuity during that period. How would you address that concern on its own terms, separate from the conduct question?" She'd expected this question. She'd been glad she had Logan to thank for it, in a way, because it was exactly the blunt question that the careful legal preparation hadn't fully addressed. "I ran the company from my medical leave," she said. "The Q3 numbers are in your quarterly report. Revenue was up 4% over the same period last year. 3 major client contracts renewed during my absence. My team performed because I'd built a team capable of performing." She paused. "A leader who can only function if they're physically present in the building isn't leading. They're occupying space." She looked at Greaves directly. "I built something that works. The continuity concern was a framing device, not a genuine concern. The documentation supports that." Greaves looked at his packet. He didn't argue. The third question didn't come from a shareholder. It came from Richard Forsythe. He'd been quiet for 40 minutes, which was the quiet of a man doing calculations under pressure, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who's made a decision and is now executing it. "I'd like to make a statement," he said. Daniels looked at him. It was the look of someone who's expecting an ally to hold a line and is watching them step back from it. "I have reviewed the documentation presented this morning," Forsythe said, "and I want to clarify, for the record, that my communications with outside counsel were exploratory in nature and did not represent a formal or coordinated effort to undermine company leadership." He paused. "I will not be supporting the special resolution." The room shifted. Not dramatically. There was no gasp. Nobody stood up. But the air changed the way air changes when the number of people leaning one direction suddenly doesn't balance the number leaning the other. Daniels was still. the absolute controlled kind. Christine Park wrote something on her notepad. Victoria kept her face composed and her hands still and said, "Thank you, Mr. Forsyth. We'll note that for the record." She looked at the room. "Are there further questions?" There were 3 more. She answered all of them. When the vote was called, the special resolution was defeated by a margin that was not close. It was not the moment she'd imagined, in the months of imagining it. She'd imagined she would feel something enormous, vindication, triumph, the specific and satisfying collapse of the thing she'd been carrying. She'd imagined it would feel like something releasing. What it actually felt like was accurate, like a seam that had finally gone where it was supposed to go. Marcus shook her hand and then, after a brief pause of professional restraint, hugged her, which was the first time in 4 years of working together he'd done that. Priya was already packing her briefcase with the brisk satisfaction of someone who'd done the job well and was ready for the next one. Shareholders she'd known for years came to speak to her, brief and meaningful conversations, the ones that happen at the end of things when people can say what they actually mean. Daniels left without speaking to her. She watched him go. The straight back, the controlled walk, the manner intact even in defeat. And she thought about what it cost to be a person who would do what he'd done, and she found she felt something closer to pity than to triumph, which surprised her and then didn't. Forsyth stopped beside her as he was leaving. He was a tall man, and up close, he looked older than he did across a conference table, which was what stress did to people in proportion to what they'd done to deserve it. "I want you to know," he started. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I want to anyway. What I did was wrong. I told myself it was about the company, and it was about me. I should have come to you directly." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded. "I understand if the review goes forward." "It will go forward," she said. "It has to. But what you did today," she paused. "That matters. I want you to know that it matters." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he walked out, and she turned back to the room where Marcus was on the phone, and Priya was still packing, and through the windows the city was doing its ordinary business in the ordinary morning light. She stood there for a moment. She took out her phone. "It's done," she texted Logan. 3 seconds. "I know," he wrote back. "How?" "Because you said I would." A pause. Then, "How do you feel?" She looked at the room, at the windows, at the view she'd paid for from this building she'd built. "Like I want to come home," she wrote. She read it back before she sent it, and then she sent it. His response came immediately, no pause this time. Then, "Come home." She gave herself 2 days to handle the immediate aftermath. Calls with Marcus, calls with Priya, a statement released through their communications team that was measured and professional and said exactly what needed to be said without performing anything that didn't need to be there. She took calls from 3 of the shareholders who'd been in the room and who wanted to express support in the way that people do when a situation is resolved and they want to be on the right side of it. She was gracious, because grace cost her nothing, and the relationships were real regardless of the timing. On the second day, she called Marcus at noon and said, "I'm going to Millhaven for the weekend." "You should," he said. "You should take longer than that." "I'm taking the weekend." "The independent review is in your hands and Priya's hands, and those are good hands," she said. "I'll be reachable." "Victoria," he paused. "I've worked for you for 4 years. In those 4 years, I've seen you take 3 vacations. Each of them was cut short." Another pause. "Take the weekend and then some. The company will be here." She was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you're trying to get rid of me." "I'm trying to make you take a break before you burn out on your own comeback," he said, "which is exactly the kind of thing you would do." She thought about this. 1 week, she said. 1 week, he agreed, as if this were a generous offer rather than the bare minimum. She drove to Millhaven that afternoon, and the drive felt different than it had the first time she'd made it. The first time she'd been running towards somewhere quiet. This time, she was going towards something specific. She knew the difference now. Logan was in the workshop when she arrived. She could see the light through the window, the way she'd seen it on nights when she was on her side of the lot, and he was still working, and the sight of it was so specifically familiar that it landed somewhere in her chest without her permission. She knocked on the workshop door. He opened it, and he looked at her for a moment in the doorway, the way he'd looked at her in the park the first day. Not assessing exactly, more like making sure something was actually there. Then he stepped back to let her in. The bookcase was still on the central bench. Finished now. The finish even on both sides, the fabric on the seat cushion clean and smooth. It was complete in the way of things that had found what they were supposed to be. "You kept it," she said. "Yeah." He looked at it. Couldn't figure out who else it was for. She looked at him. He was in his work clothes, a smudge of stain on his left arm, in the same place it always seemed to land, and he was looking at her with the same direct quality he always had. No performance, just him being there. "Logan," she said. "Victoria. I need to tell you something." "Okay." She looked at the bookcase, then back at him. I've been thinking about what I want," she said. "Not what I'm running from or toward, not the company or the next thing, just what I actually want." He was quiet, waiting. "I want this," she said. "Whatever this is, the park and the workshop and the dinner table and the phone calls." She paused. "I want Marigold's salamander painting, which I know you told me about, so I've already ruined the surprise, and I'm sorry about that, but I want it anyway." He almost smiled, and she continued. "I want to come back here at the end of things that are hard. I want to know that this is the place I come back to." She swallowed. "I'm telling you this before I have it figured out. I'm telling you while it's still messy, and I still don't know exactly how it fits together, because I spent a long time waiting until things were figured out before I said them, and I think that's how I lost time I didn't have to lose." He was still. The good kind of still. "I know you have a life here that works," she said, "and I know I come with a lot of—" She made a gesture. "A lot of complicated. And I know Marigold is the most important thing, and whatever this is has to be right for her, not just right for us." "Victoria, I'm not done." "You kind of are," he said, with the gentleness that somehow made it not dismissive. She stopped. He moved from where he was standing to, not quickly, nothing about Logan Reed was done quickly. And he crossed the workshop, and he was standing in front of her, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on her porch in the dark. The same plain, present, agenda-free looking. "I've been waiting for you to catch up," he said. "I've been waiting since about the second week." She looked at him. "You could have said something. You were in the middle of a war, he said. "I wasn't going to add something else to carry." She felt something in her chest do the thing it did around him, the loosening, the release of something held. "That's—" She stopped. "That's a very Logan thing to do." "Is it?" "You show up and you wait and you don't ask for anything and you just—" She pressed her lips together. "You just stay." "That's usually the idea," he said. She looked up at him. The workshop was warm and smelled like wood, and the light was the same two-bulb working light it always was, unflattering and practical and honest. She thought about what a photograph of this moment would look like, and she thought it would look nothing like anything she'd imagined for her life. And that was the best thing about it. "Logan Reed," she said. "Yeah, well, I choose you too," she said, "just so you know." He looked at her for one moment that was long enough to mean something, and then he reached up and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear that had escaped from where she'd pinned it, a small and entirely ordinary gesture. And then he kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss, not the kind built for an audience. It was the kind you have when you've been talking to someone for months, and you know the shape of their thinking, and you've sat at each other's kitchen tables and fixed radiators together, and asked blunt questions and stayed on the phone past midnight. And the kiss is just the place where all of that finally goes from implied to said. It was short and certain, and when it ended, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. From the house, through the connecting door, came a small and unmistakable voice. "Dad? Is Victoria here? Her car is in the lot." Logan pulled back. His expression was the one she'd cataloged in her memory without meaning to. The almost smile, the warmth under the surface of the everyday. Yeah, bud, he called. She's in the workshop. 30 seconds later, the door opened and Marigold Reed came in at the speed Marigold Reed did everything, which was the speed of someone who'd made a decision and was executing it, and she crossed the workshop and she hugged Victoria around the middle with the unself-conscious force of a child who hugs without calculating whether a hug is appropriate. Victoria put her arms around her. She hadn't hugged a child in she didn't know how long. She hadn't had a child in her life to hug. The feeling of it was so specific and so whole, the small solidity of her, the warmth, that Victoria stood in the middle of the workshop and held this 8-year-old who studied salamanders and painted rocks and said things that were accurate rather than diplomatic. And she felt something she'd been missing for a very long time without knowing she'd been missing it. You won, Marigold said into her side. Who told you that? Dad said you had a big meeting and that you were very brave. She pulled back and looked up. Did you use the receipt thing? Victoria looked at Logan. He raised his hand slightly, the gesture of someone who had decided not to fight the information flow in his household. I used the receipt thing, she said. Good, Marigold said with satisfaction. That was a good idea. It was your dad's idea. His good ideas are usually good, she said, in the tone of someone conceding a point they found slightly inconvenient. I have something for you. I made it at school. Don't look excited because Dad probably told you. He mentioned something, Victoria said, but I don't know what it looks like. Marigold ran back to the house and came back in 90 seconds with a flat, wrapped thing that had been wrapped in the particular way of children. A great deal of tape, not much paper, corners that had been surrendered to rather than folded. Victoria unwrapped it. It was a painting on heavy paper, a salamander on a rock in a creek, rendered in orange and brown, and an ambitious attempt at green that had wandered into the blue territory. The salamander had very round eyes and 4 legs of varying lengths, and it was clearly, despite all of this, a salamander. The water around the rock was blue with streaks of silver that were catching light, which was a detail that demonstrated more observation of real water than most adult painters bothered with. Marigold, Victoria said. I know it's not perfect, she said immediately, in the tone of someone getting ahead of criticism. The legs are wrong. I looked it up after. And the colors. Marigold. Victoria crouched down to her level, holding the painting. It's wonderful. I know you said that, but I mean it. So do I, she said. And she meant it in all the ways a thing can be meant. The painting itself and what it represented, and the child who'd made it without being asked, who'd decided that Victoria was someone worth making something for. Marigold studied her face for a moment with the focused attention she brought to creek observations and bird documentaries and difficult questions about what things meant. Are you going to stay now? She asked. Victoria looked at her. Then she looked up at Logan, who was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed and the steady, patient expression of a man who'd decided to let this moment be whatever it was going to be. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. Marigold nodded once, decisively, as if this were a reasonable answer that had required confirmation. Okay, she said. Then, can we go see if the salamanders are still at the creek? Logan uncrossed his arms. It's almost dark. The early dark, not the late dark. There's still some left. Your shoes. She was already halfway to the house door. I'll get my shoes and my jacket, and I'll meet you on the path. The door swung shut behind her. Victoria stood up slowly, still holding the painting. She's going to be fine, Logan said. I know. Victoria looked at the painting. She's remarkable. She had her grandmother's stubbornness and her mother's capacity for disappearing into the things she loves, and something else I can't account for that showed up on its own, he said. She's going to be completely fine. Victoria looked at him. So are you, she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the thing that happens when someone says out loud a truth you've been quietly carrying. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, yeah, quietly, and he meant it. She also has a father who shows up for things, Victoria said. I want to say that, because I don't think it gets said enough. Logan looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked back up, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen when he looked at the bookcase. Not proud, not searching, just someone recognizing that something had become what it was supposed to be. Come on, he said, before she goes to the creek alone. They walked out into the evening together, the three of them, through the lot and onto the path that led to the park. Marigold ahead, with her jacket halfway on, and her shoes correctly tied because she'd actually remembered. And the light was the particular gray gold of a fall evening that hasn't fully given up yet. And the air smelled like dead leaves and the beginning of cold, and the creek was audible before they could see it. They found two salamanders. Marigold crouched at the bank with the patience of a naturalist and documented them in her notebook with a seriousness that Logan watched from a few feet back, hands in his pockets. Victoria stood beside him. "She's going to be a biologist," Victoria said quietly, "or an attorney. She argues everything." "Both, maybe." "Well, that's a very specific nightmare," Logan said, but his voice was full of it. "The love that's also exhaustion, the pride that's also terror, the whole complicated weight of caring about someone who's going to keep becoming more themselves no matter what you do." Victoria slipped her hand into his. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just because they were standing next to each other and it was the natural place for her hand to go, and his hand closed around hers with the same quality as everything else he did, present and unhurried and certain. Marigold looked up from the creek. "There's a third one," she announced. "Under the big rock. I can see its tail." She looked at Victoria. "Do you want to come see?" Victoria looked down at the creek bank, at the mud, at her good shoes. She looked at Marigold's face, which was open and inviting in the way of a child who's extending the best things she has to offer. She stepped off the path. "Show me," she said. There's a version of this story that ends at the shareholder meeting. The vote. The vindication. Victoria Hale walking out of that room with her company intact, and the people who'd underestimated her appropriately reckoning with what that meant. That's a satisfying ending. It's also an incomplete one. Because the thing that the board never understood, the thing that Elliot, for all his intelligence and access, had fundamentally miscalculated, was that what they were trying to take from Victoria Hale wasn't her company. Her company was what she'd built because she was good at building things. But what she'd discovered in a small rented apartment in a town she'd half grown up in, beside a creek that flooded every April with a man who asked good questions and a child who noticed things, was what she'd actually been trying to build all along. The shareholder meeting was in November. In February, Victoria transferred the primary operational base of Hale Industries' new infrastructure division to an office in Millhaven. She kept the city headquarters. She went back 2 or 3 times a month. But the Millhaven office was the one where she worked most days, and it was 3 minutes from a workshop where the finished bookcase had found its permanent wall, and 5 minutes from a school where an 8-year-old was currently making the case to her teacher that the local creek watershed deserved its own dedicated study unit. The case was persuasive. The unit was approved. Marcus visited in March and stood in the kitchen of the house on Callaway Street, which had been on the market in December and which Victoria had bought with the straightforward determination of someone who knew what she wanted and had stopped waiting for permission to want it. He stood in the kitchen looking at the radiator against the wall, original to the building, fixed once with hardware store parts, and Logan's handwriting on a receipt. And he said, "This is not what I expected." "I know," she said. "It's better," he said. "I want to be clear that I mean that." She made him coffee and they talked about the independent review, which had concluded with consequences for Daniels and a formal censure for 2 others and a quiet settlement with Forsyth that none of them would be discussing publicly. The company was stable. The board had been restructured with 2 new members who'd come through a process that Victoria had overhauled herself. The enterprise division that the acquisition would have dismantled had its best quarter in 3 years. Marcus left in the afternoon, and that evening, Logan came home with sawdust in his hair, and Marigold came home with a drawing of the creek watershed that her teacher had asked her to present to the class. And they ate dinner at the kitchen table with the radiator humming in the corner, and nobody's phone rang with anything urgent. It wasn't perfect. Victoria's relationship with the city was complicated by her absence, and she knew it and was managing it imperfectly. The logistics of splitting time and attention and presence between 2 places was real and sometimes exhausting, and they hadn't solved it. They were just living inside it and solving it as they went. There were evenings when she was short-tempered from too many hours on the phone, and Logan would give her space she didn't ask for but needed. And there were mornings when he was in the workshop before dawn because a commission deadline had crept up, and she'd make coffee and bring it out without being asked, and he'd look up with the expression that still, months later, undid something in her chest every time. There were also moments with Marigold that she hadn't known to prepare for. The Tuesday afternoon she'd been helping her with a book report, and Marigold had said with the matter-of-fact certainty she brought to statements she'd clearly been sitting on for a while, "I think you're going to be my family." Not a question, not a request for confirmation, just a statement of something she'd worked out and was now reporting. Victoria had sat at the kitchen table with a red pen in her hand and felt something move through her so completely that she'd had to take a breath before she could answer. And what she'd said was, "I think so too," which was not the full measure of what she felt, but was the truest thing she could say while still being able to speak. A person can build things their whole life and mistake the building for the point. Victoria had done this. She knew she'd done it. She could trace it back through the years like a seam that had been slightly off from the beginning, pulling everything that rested on it slightly off too. She'd built Hale Industries because she was good at it, and because it mattered to her, and because she'd needed, for a long time, to prove to herself that she could. And all three of those things were real, and none of them were the things she'd been missing. What she'd been missing was simpler and harder than any company she'd ever built. It was the ordinary weight of being known by specific people in a specific place. Being the one who fixed the radiator. Being the person Marigold came to with the salamander question she'd been saving up. Being the woman that Logan Reed looked at in the workshop light like she'd come back from somewhere far and was finally where she was supposed to be. None of it had been what she was looking for. That's the part she thinks about sometimes. The fact that she'd driven to Millhaven to disappear, to rest, to find somewhere quiet enough to hear herself think. And what she'd found instead was a park bench and a child who noticed sad people and a man with sawdust on his hands who asked real questions and didn't wait for her to be easy. She hadn't been looking for any of it, and that, she'd come to understand, was probably why she'd found it. Logan proposed in this workshop. Not in the spring when everything is performing beauty, not in a restaurant someone spent 3 weeks booking. In the workshop on a Tuesday evening in April, when the light was the working light and the smell was linseed oil, and the bookcase was on its wall, and the half-finished dining table was on the central bench where the bookcase used to be. He'd been working when she came in to say goodnight, and he'd looked up from what he was doing and set down his chisel and said, "I have something," and he'd reached into the shelf above the bench. The shelf where he kept his measuring tools and a coffee mug and the paperback he was currently reading, and he'd produced a ring that she later learned he'd designed himself and had made by a jeweler in town who'd worked from his sketch. He held it without getting down on one knee, which she would have found slightly ridiculous given the floor, and he said, "I know you have a whole life that was already complicated before you met me. I know this is a lot of things at once. And I know you know what you're getting, which is a workshop and an 8-year-old with opinions, and a town that floods every April and somebody who's going to keep making you coffee when you're working late." "Logan, I'm not done," he said, with the smallest edge of a smile. "Okay," she said. "I just want to know if you want to keep doing this," he said. "Officially. All of it. The complicated parts and the ordinary parts both." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at the workshop around her. The tools in their places, the wood shaving swept to the edges, the light she could have drawn from memory. She looked at this man who'd shown up with groceries and fixed things she hadn't asked him to fix and asked blunt questions and picked up the phone. "Yes?" she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which was the most Logan Reed thing about the whole thing, that he'd measured it somehow, had paid attention at some point to something she hadn't known he was paying attention to, and it was right. She kissed him in the workshop with the smell of linseed oil and the working light, and somewhere in the house, Marigold was asleep with her salamander notebook open on the bed, and Victoria Hale, who had been afraid that no one would choose her when life got hard, stood in a garage workshop in a small town being chosen on an ordinary Tuesday night. And it was the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to her. There are things you spend years building that turn out to be the scaffold for the thing you actually needed. The scaffold isn't wasted. It holds you up while you figure it out, and the figuring out requires the holding. But at some point you look at what you've built, and you understand that it was always the means, and never the end, And the end is something you couldn't have planned because you didn't know yet what you were building toward. This is the part that nobody tells you when they talk about ambition and success and the things worth spending a life on. That sometimes the most important thing you'll ever build is a reason to come home.